This video will go over briefly the content of this module, the module which will be punishment and extinction as ways to reduce problem behaviors. Some of these overheads are taken partially from the PowerPoints provided by the publisher, but most are original. Covered the basic principles of punishment and extinction in the first semester, aba2. So let's just briefly review right now about punishment, the positive versus negative punishment. Positive punishment is also referred to as type 1 punishment, and it involves the contingent presentation of some stimulus following a behavior, and this contingency results in a decrease in the frequency of the behavior in the future. Again, it's a presentation of a stimulus that must also result in future decrease. Negative punishment is either the termination of some stimulus that's present, or it's the removal of some stimulus contingent on a problem behavior, and again it also must result in reduction. So response cost, for example, is negative punishment. You're removing some reinforcer, as a matter of fact. So positive and negative punishment, type 1 and type 2, just terms you should know. There, of course, are some considerations for using punishment. We, again, talked about last semester. But first off, punishment doesn't really enhance any positive behaviors. So it might decrease a problem behavior, but what will take its place, or what should be present instead of the problem behavior? Think about the competing behavior model. You've got acceptable behaviors, you've got problem behaviors. Punishment doesn't address acceptable behaviors. There are often undesirable effects of punishment. These are referred to as side effects, but they're not side effects, they're direct effects. There are ethical and legal considerations that we'll talk about later, and we should remember that all punishment is not created equal, as they say. Some forms of punishment people find to be acceptable and are quite mild: response cost, reprimands, non-exclusionary timeout. And I think there are differences in the ethical consideration depending on whether we're considering these milder forms of punishment or the harsher ones. So during this module, you're going to read about these types of clinical procedures that are technically punishment. We're going to talk about timeout. It's a negative punishment, type 2. And we can have both non-exclusion and exclusion. And in the exclusion, there are typically thought about as an isolation timeout. Response costs, negative, type 2. Reprimands, other contingent aversives, which your book talks about, although most of these are historical and not currently used. And things called overcorrection, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So what are the undesirable effects of punishment? The broadest category is something called counter-control, which I'm going to go into in detail. And counter-control does overlap the things that follow. Punishment is an aversive situation, so people that are being punished often seek to avoid the person that's doing the punishing. And of course, if this is a parent or a teacher, for example, that kind of avoidance can be undesirable. Punishment can result in emotional and aggressive behaviors. And those emotional and aggressive behaviors in response to punishment may be either operant behaviors or genetic kinds of behaviors. Punishment is an undesirable thing. So when we punish children, for example, we're modeling behaviors that are probably undesirable. And of course, the people doing punishing events can themselves be reinforced because, for example, yelling at a child. The child immediately stops doing what they're supposed to, then the person doing the yelling is reinforced. This can create bad cycles where in the future the person, the controller if you will, is more likely to use punishment. So let's talk for a minute about the idea of counter-control. It's probably true that much of our behavior is in fact under aversive control. We typically avoid being punished, or we avoid aversives, and a lot of our behavior is like this. And one way to avoid aversiveness is by doing what somebody wants. So if the controller is punishing us, then we can simply stop doing what we're being punished for. We could avoid them altogether. If we stop doing what the controller is trying to control, then the controller is reinforced. Their behavior, their punishing behavior, is reinforced. We could also do something that doesn't reinforce the controller, but also reduces the punishment. So it would turn off the aversive, if you will, but the controller is not being reinforced. Avoidance or escape or aggression. So certainly if you're aggressive towards the punisher, that may make them stop punishing you, and they're not reinforced. So we just simply call this kind of response to aversives or punishment as counter control. It's not a separate principle of behavior. It's the kinds of behaviors that are understood through the typical principles of behavior, punishment and reinforcement. But it's a category of specific interactions that probably causes a huge amount of problems in the real world. Certainly counter control is very prevalent. It's a product of learning history. And it seems likely that people develop very sophisticated repertoires of counter control behaviors as they grow up. How much we have as sophisticated measures of counter control depends on our own learning histories. People have called it a side effect of punishment, but again, counter control is a direct effect of punishment. And of course, every time we respond, it doesn't have to be reinforcement to produce future increases. So if by exhibiting some form of counter control we can stop someone from punishing us, it doesn't need to happen every time, but if it happens enough, we'll continue to do it. Let's talk about timeout from positive reinforcement first. Timeout involves the withdrawal, contingent on a misbehavior, that's an important thing, of the opportunity to earn positive reinforcement for some period of time. So timeout is a contingent kind of thing. It's contingent on some behavior. Someone else reduces the opportunity to earn reinforcers for a period of time. And timeout is then a punishment as long as it decreases future behavior. Sometimes what people call timeout actually reinforces inappropriate behavior. We'll discuss this in a second. For timeout to work, there has to be a big discrepancy between the timeout period and the time-in period. In other words, if there are no reinforcers really available during the time-in period, then timeout procedure we call timeout might not be effective. So the loss of access to reinforcement has to be contingent on target behavior. Timeout is a contingency. And again, there has to be a future decrease. So the biggest point here is that for timeout to work, time-in must be somewhat reinforcing, and the loss of the ability to earn reinforcers is what, in effect, is punishment. Your reading materials cover these things pretty thoroughly, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but let's talk about the two major categories. The first one of non-exclusion. That includes things like planned ignoring, a temporary withdrawal of the opportunity to earn some specific reinforcement, the timeout ribbon, for example, contingent observation, sit and watch procedure, and then the timeout ribbon itself. These are all explained in your book. And non-exclusion means the person is not excluded from activities, but they simply, for some period of time, can't earn reinforcers. Exclusionary or isolation forms of timeouts, of course, results in the inability to earn reinforcers contingent on behavior, but there also involves being excluded from the time-in environment. Timeout rooms, many of you have seen these, partition timeouts, hallway timeouts, all of these can come under this idea of exclusion. And the timeout room is truly isolation, and its use presents the biggest problems. Planned ignoring is the simplest form of timeout, and it may not even seem like timeout to you, but for example, let's just say that you're a teacher and you're working with a child one-to-one, and they frequently disrupt the instruction, they whine, and through a functional assessment you realize that this disruption and whining is being reinforced by attention. Well, timeout would be simply then withholding attention. You could look away for 20 seconds and pay no attention at all, contingent on the misbehavior. So for 20 seconds, it's timeout because their ability to earn reinforcers, your attention, is temporarily removed. So in fact, that's a form of timeout. Another form of planned ignoring, I can recall a study where kids had a little orange tab on their desk. If it was flipped up, they could earn reinforcers. When the teacher flipped it down, they couldn't earn reinforcers. They would be ignored. They could continue to work. They're not excluded, but they're not going to be reinforced. That's a form of timeout, the least intrusive form. So, what are some undesirable and desirable aspects of timeout? Well, non-exclusionary timeout, like the planned ignoring, is relatively easy to apply. On the other hand, exclusionary and isolation timeout can be very difficult to apply. Non-exclusionary timeouts appear to be acceptable to people like teachers and community workers. Isolation timeout does not have this acceptability. Timeout can result in rapid suppression of problem behaviors. It can be easily combined. But the problem with timeout as a procedure, if the behavior is maintained by escape, negatively reinforced maintenance, then it would be reinforcing. For example, to put a kid in a timeout room. If he's reinforced by escaping his math, then basically putting him in timeout provides for math escape. Misbehavior in a timeout room can be a problem. If any of you have ever used a timeout room, it's amazing the number of problem behaviors that can be exhibited there. There could be a physical confrontation if you try to get to someone to an exclusion or isolation timeout room. Again, many of you have experienced this. It's difficult to get, for example, a large, strong person to the timeout room if they don't want to go. A timeout because of ethics and just simple logistics, exclusionary timeout primarily, requires a high level of supervision and monitoring, which is often very difficult to do. The next general category of punishment is response costs. It's just loss of a specific amount of reinforcement. Contingent on target behavior and the future behavior is reduced. So for example, taking back some award or a sticker, a fine if you're in a token economy. So if you misbehave, you lose 2 tokens. Tokens could be earned through a positive behavior, but those are all response costs. Losing 5 minutes of recess contingent on misbehavior is a form of response cost. Taking away part of someone's weekly allowance is a form of response cost. Response cost is typically acceptable, and it's really widely used, but it is a form of punishment. And response cost is talked about in more detail in your book, but it has some desirable aspects. Typically a rapid decrease, convenient, and can be combined. It has some downsides too. Taking away something you've already given to someone could result in aggressive counter-controlling behaviors, for example, or confrontations. So using response costs like any form of punishment, one must consider what other effects that are undesirable that may accompany the use of a particular response cost procedure. I worked in a large program for children classified as having an emotional disability. We used response costs, and taking away points at times created its own problems with students. They would become aggressive or disruptive if points were taken away, and it resulted in a confrontation. Of course, these can be managed, and your book talks about some ways to manage response costs. Later on, we'll have a section on a token economy, then we can see some ways, in fact, within a token economy to manage response cost. Response cost considerations are as follows. First off, you have to have something to lose. Go back to the token economy I talked about, or a point system. If you have point systems where throughout a period kids earn points, for example, for appropriate work or for good behavior, when the period starts off, they don't have any points. So what happens if they misbehave? What will you take away? So you have to have something. This results in the use of things like the bonus timeout discussed in your book. Again, increased aggression, and of course avoidance of the person who does the response cost. That person can become a condition aversive stimulus like any other punisher can. Response costs can actually call attention to inappropriate behaviors, which could be reinforcing. There could be some unpredictability about what might happen. And response costs may unintentionally suppress desirable behaviors that happen to be nearby or nearby in time. And your textbook talks about some other positive punishments or type 1 punishments that have been used in the past that are not used widely, and some that are. The contingent application of mild electric shock, of lemon juice, of water mist, of shielding by a facial cloth, those were used in the past. Many, many decades ago, I worked in a program that used contingent aversives. This was very early in with children that had severe, for example, self-injurious behaviors, and it had been discovered that a drop of lemon juice on their tongue, for example, when they would self-injure themselves, could actually stop the self-injury. Lovas, the famous autism pioneer, used very mild electric shock, a little wand powered by a battery, touched the leg of someone that was, for example, exhibiting self-injury, and it suppressed it. We think of these in kind of horrified ways now, but they were used because there was nothing else available. I think all of these things like that should probably never be used. There are too many positive ways to reduce behaviors besides those, but it is important to at least understand the historical aspect of these and the fact that they were used. Reprimands are talked about in your book, and reprimands can be punishing. Of course, a reprimand could serve as attention in general and actually be reinforcing. Contingent exercise has been used again historically, I suspect, and something called overcorrection, which might still be used. It's talked about in your book. Again, the most controversial of these is the use of noxious stimuli, and I certainly do not recommend them at all, and I think that their use these days is simply completely unjustified. Overcorrection is something that was used, I think, primarily 2 or 3 decades ago. I suspect it's still being used, although I've not seen it in a while. Restitutional overcorrection and positive practice overcorrection. Positive practices involves repeatedly performing some correct behavior, typically related to the problem behavior, like if a kid gets out of his seat without permission, having him get out of his stand up, sit down, and so forth. Restitutional overcorrection involves making things right, if it were. You steal something, you have to get something back that you stole, and then something else. These can be effective, and I can still see where some of these could be used, but they do require close monitoring and quite a bit of attention on the part of a supervisor, for example, and therefore have their disadvantages. These are discussed certainly in your book. Punishment should be used, if at all, as part of a package that certainly contains reinforcement. Punishment could be the part of your intervention packet where you consider disabling the problem behavior. However, almost any form of punishment should never be the first thing tried. And the more severe forms of punishment, for example, timeout, should only be a last resort when other positive means have not been effective. There must be a very careful consideration of the use of punishment, including undesirable effects. Timeout, I think, requires institutional policies, as far as I'm concerned, to be used, and careful monitoring. Things like reprimands or response costs, those certainly could be applied. They're mild, acceptable, don't necessarily require any embarrassing things for the person being punished, and they're acceptable in our culture. But nonetheless, any form of punishment can produce undesirable effects, counter-controlling behaviors, if you will. If you're going to use punishment, they've got to be used consistently. The punisher has to be intense enough to work, but of course, not too intense. Punishment should always be faded, and absolutely any form of punishment should be carefully monitored and evaluated. It's an ethical issue. Your book outlines clearly the ethical considerations in using punishment. People have a right to safe and humane treatment. Punishment doesn't address the things we want to increase or maintain. We've got to consider the least restrictive alternative as in reducing problem behaviors, and that's the positive first, and then combining positive with punishment, possibly second. The right to effective treatment, however, is an ethical consideration. Is punishment the only effective method? I'll never say never on this, but it's something that would have to be considered. If punishment were the only thing effective for some very serious behavior, then if a person has a right to effective treatment, it may need to be used. But again, for the more serious forms of punishment, like timeout or anything that's embarrassing or physically noxious or dangerous, those always must have followed policy, and there must be treatment safeguards. Extinction, of course, has been used clinically, and its effectiveness depends on that we've identified the sources of reinforcement and we can control it. It obviously involves removing contingency. So if something has been contingently reinforced, extinction involves removing reinforcement, period. It's not like timeout because it's not a contingent temporary thing. It's a complete removal of contingencies, not contingent on behavior, but just in general. There are clinically undesirable effects of extinction by itself, but extinction or attempts at extinction combined with other things like differential reinforcement can enhance the effectiveness of things like reinforcement. The problem with most forms of extinction, like let's just take attention-based misbehaviors, it's difficult to ignore some behaviors. On the other hand, you could reduce the amount of attention given. So clinically, when we talk about extinction, often that involves not a complete extinction, but rather a reduction of the amount of reinforcement that's available for problem behaviors, which of course means that's not extinction at all. When we use extinction combined with positive things, it basically is used as a disabling factor, and there's going to be the use of reinforcement for other behaviors. Remember the matching law. And there are response class issues, so there may be a number of behaviors that are part of a response class. Can we extinguish all of them? If not, then extinction would not work. And that has to do with the idea of withholding and stopping reinforcement for one topographical member of a response class, but not others. Remember the effects of extinction from last semester. It's a gradual decrease in frequency, extinction produced aggression, the idea of extinction burst, immediately beginning extinction, spontaneous recovery as behavior gets down to low levels and recovers. All these things can be expected. The good news here is we seldom, if ever, use extinction by itself. But even in a package, these things could be present. And finally, I think it's important to remember, again, this was covered last semester, the variables that affect resistance to extinction. That just means how long it takes to extinguish a behavior. And basically, behaviors that have been intermittently reinforced will take longer to extinguish. The thinner the previous intermittent schedule, the longer it will take. The response effort required to earn reinforcers once they go into extinction, that could affect extinction and so forth. And those are covered adequately in your book. So at any rate, extinction and punishment can and probably are often used as part of a package, but the parts of a package related to punishment need to be should be certainly the milder kind, like response cost, extinction, reprimands, and so forth. Other forms of punishment have much more serious legal and ethical considerations. And nonetheless, we need to understand the clinical use of these, the reasons not to use them, and their likely benefit to intervention packages.